Final Betrayal by Jasper Hawke. Chapter 1. The Assignment. London. 12:30 a.m. The rain drizzled down in sheets over the darkened streets of London, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the damp pavement. Jasper Hawke stood at the edge of an alley, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a practiced, almost predatory focus. He hadn't been assigned to London in years, but tonight it felt familiar. Too familiar. His earpiece crackled. "Hawke, you copy?" He tapped the side of his ear, adjusting the comms. "I'm here." "Good," came the low voice of Director Cross from headquarters. "The package is in play. The target is a high-level government official who's gone rogue. We need you to retrieve the documents he's carrying. The intel's critical. Nothing gets through to the press." "Understood." "Understood," Hawke replied, his gaze never leaving the shadows ahead. His fingers tightened around the sleek pistol tucked at his side, just in case the mission went south. The target, a man named Daniel Wexler, had been a trusted operative in Hawke's agency until his sudden disappearance 2 weeks ago. The fact that Wexler had gone rogue wasn't a coincidence. As Hawke knew too well, in the world of espionage, loyalty was as fluid as water. Today's ally could easily be tomorrow's enemy. And now Wexler had something the agency desperately needed to silence. The documents were rumored to contain intelligence that could compromise not just one country, but several. Hawke didn't need to be told why the mission was so important. The agency had made that clear. Keep it quiet. Get in, get out. Simple. But nothing in Hawke's world was ever simple. He adjusted his jacket and slipped deeper into the shadows, moving with precision, as if he were one with the darkness. He was a ghost, a phantom working in the shadows of a game where everyone was both a player and a pawn. But tonight, there was something different in the air, something sharp, like a storm on the horizon. A sudden movement caught his attention. A figure in the distance, stepping out from behind a row of parked cars. A man, tall, with a nondescript black coat. Hawke's instincts flared. This was too early. Wexler wasn't supposed to be here yet. He stopped and ducked into a recessed doorway, pressing himself flat against the cold stone. His mind raced. Was he being watched? A feeling of unease crept through him, but he pushed it aside. A dozen surveillance teams were supposed to be keeping eyes on Wexler. He'd follow the man now, no questions. He checked the time. The rendezvous with Wexler was supposed to happen in 15 minutes. Hawke wasn't early. Someone else was. His eyes never left the figure as the man entered the building across the street. Just as Hawke was about to move out of the doorway, a voice crackled in his earpiece again. "Hawke, we've just had a priority alert," Director Cross said, his voice tight. "Wexler's intel? It's more than just documents. He's carrying classified government codes, codes we thought were buried." Hawke's blood ran cold. The room around him seemed to darken. "Buried? What does that mean?" "I'm not sure yet," Cross replied, "but I suggest you move quickly. We've confirmed Wexler's target is bigger than anyone anticipated. We'll send you further intel as we get it." Hawke's pulse quickened, but he kept his cool. Bigger? He had expected a simple mission: retrieve the intel, get out. But the agency had a way of throwing curveballs at the worst possible moments. Now there was a different weight on his shoulders. A real one. He turned and walked out of the alley, heading for the building where Wexler had just disappeared. The rain fell harder now, drenching him as his boots splashed through puddles, the sound muffled by the ever-increasing downpour. But his focus was razor-sharp, his every step calculated. He approached the entrance of the building. No one was in sight. Quiet night. Too quiet. His earpiece buzzed again. "Get inside, Hawke." Cross's voice was low, urgent. "We've got a problem. Your extraction route is compromised. Someone's tipped off the enemy. You're not alone on this mission anymore. Watch your six." Hawke froze, his hand instinctively going to the concealed sidearm. Compromised? The familiar tension settled into his muscles, a feeling he knew all too well. He couldn't afford to get distracted, not now. His job was clear. Retrieve the documents. Find Wexler. Get out. But that voice in the back of his mind whispered again. The same voice that had kept him alive all these years in the most dangerous games on the planet. Trust no one. The door ahead was ajar, just enough for him to slip inside undetected. He exhaled and moved quickly. Inside, the building was dark, with only the distant hum of fluorescent lights piercing the silence. Hawke's trained eyes scanned the hallways, his movements silent, deliberate. Every noise, every shadow, every flicker of light was something to be watched. He crept closer to the sound of murmured voices. Wexler was nearby, but the voices didn't belong to him. Hawke pushed himself into a crouch against the wall, listening intently. Two figures, one low voice, one sharp, precise. "Not taking him alive," said the first voice. Hawke's heart rate accelerated. "The enemy? Do it quickly. The agency will handle it from here." The second voice responded. His mind went into overdrive. The agency? What did they know? He could feel the trap snapping shut around him. The enemy wasn't just after Wexler. They were after him too. Someone inside his own government had sold him out, and now he was the one being hunted. He stepped back into the shadows, rethinking his next move. The plan had changed. No longer just a retrieval mission. This was now a race against time, and against those he thought he could trust. The hunt had begun, and for the first time in his career, Jasper Hawke wasn't sure who the real enemy was. Chapter 2. The Betrayal. London. 1:15 a.m. The darkness outside the building mirrored the blackness in Jasper Hawke's mind as he crouched behind a stack of metal filing cabinets, his breath slow and steady. He had been compromised. Someone inside the agency had tipped off the enemy. He'd only been a few steps behind Wexler when everything shifted. His mission was no longer just a matter of retrieving the documents. It was a race against enemies both seen and unseen. And the worst part? He had no idea who the real enemy was. He needed answers. And he needed them fast. The voices were growing louder now. Hawke's instincts kicked in, sharpening his focus as he eased around the corner, staying hidden in the shadows. There were two men, both wearing nondescript suits, moving cautiously through the building. They weren't agents, not from the looks of them, not even close. His hand went instinctively to his pistol, the cold steel a comforting reminder of the tools at his disposal. His breathing slowed further as he observed them, careful, calculating. They knew what they were doing. They'd been trained. They were good. Too good. He had to make a decision. He couldn't let them see him, and he couldn't risk being caught. He needed to move quickly, get to Wexler before they did, and extract whatever information he could. The odds of a clean escape were dwindling with every passing second. Suddenly, the building's power flickered. The overhead lights buzzed for a moment before plunging everything into darkness. Hawke tensed, a shadow among shadows. This was his chance. The room was now his canvas, silent, unseen. Ready for his next move, he moved without hesitation, darting down the hall with practiced ease, his footsteps silent. He approached the room where Wexler's trail had led him, a small office at the far end of the corridor. A metal door with a simple keypad guarded the entrance. Hawke paused, scanning for any surveillance systems or hidden cameras. Everything was clear. His fingers brushed against the keypad, entering the code he had received earlier. Clicked open with a soft hiss. Inside, the room was sparse. A desk, a few filing cabinets, and a window offering a panoramic view of the darkened London skyline. Wexler was nowhere to be seen. Hawke's eyes immediately fell to the desk, where a briefcase sat in the center. It was unlocked, the contents spilling out in plain sight. A set of papers, hastily stuffed into a manila folder, and something else. A black envelope. His heart skipped a beat as he picked it up. There were no markings on it, nothing to indicate its contents. But the texture of the paper felt foreign, strange. Not something you'd find in any normal office. He flipped it open, feeling a chill crawl up his spine as he saw the documents inside. Classified intelligence. Worse than he had been led to believe. These weren't just national security secrets, they were global. The contents were enough to bring governments to their knees, to expose covert operations that spanned continents, involving several of the world's most powerful players. The names were redacted, but the countries listed on the files, they were enough to make the air feel suffocating. Someone had been playing a much bigger game than Hawke had realized, and now he was caught in the middle of it. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Hawke's pulse quickened. It wasn't just one person. It was a group. He quickly stuffed the envelope into his jacket, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to stay here. If he was caught with this intel, it was game over. He needed to get out, and fast. The door creaked open just as he was about to retreat into the hallway, and two men entered the office. Their eyes locked on the desk before falling to the briefcase, and the black envelope. Hawke's breath caught in his throat. They knew. Before he could react, one of the men spoke. "Damn it, he's already been here." The other man reached for a communicator, but Hawke was already moving, his body springing into action. The two men didn't stand a chance. With swift precision, Hawke disarmed the first man, sending him crashing into the wall, and incapacitated the second with a well-placed elbow to the neck. They dropped to the ground, unconscious. Hawke wasted no time in ensuring they wouldn't be able to follow him. He darted into the hallway, moving like a phantom through the darkened building, his senses sharp as he adjusted his plan. The exit was on the other side of the building. He could take the fire escape, avoid the main doors, and lose himself in the maze of London's alleyways. But as he rounded a corner, he froze. A familiar face was waiting for him. It was Cross, Director Cross. Hawke's heart sank. He hadn't expected this. Not now. Not here. "What the hell are you doing here?" Hawke snapped, keeping his distance, his hands still on his weapon. Cross's eyes were cold, calculating. "I could ask you the same thing, Hawke. You've been compromised. The agency wants the intel back. Now." Hawke's mind raced. The last thing he'd expected was for Cross to show up, let alone be part of the trap. It made sense, though. Someone at the top had orchestrated this. Someone who wanted him out of the picture. "You don't get it," Hawke said, his voice low. "Wexler's documents? They're bigger than you think. Someone inside our own government is behind this." Cross's gaze flickered, a hint of something, suspicion, behind his eyes. "And you think you can fix this? You're a pawn in a much larger game, Hawke. And I'm afraid you've already lost." Hawke narrowed his eyes. "A pawn? You've been playing with fire, Director," Hawke said, his tone hardening. "And now the flames are coming for all of us." Cross's lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The flames are already here, Hawke. You just don't know it yet." Without another word, Cross turned and disappeared into the shadows. Hawke stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his situation sinking in. His own government, the agency he had served faithfully, had betrayed him. He was no longer just running from Wexler. He was running from his own people. This was bigger than anyone had told him. And if he didn't move fast, it would consume him. Chapter 3. A New Alliance. London. 2:45 a.m. The damp air of the London night felt suffocating as Hawke's footsteps echoed through the alleyways. The shadows were thick around him, but his mind was darker still. Cross's words had hit harder than he cared to admit. The agency was no longer his ally. He'd become a target, and the people who had once trusted him were now hunting him down. Where do I go from here? The question gnawed at him as he made his way through the twisting streets, avoiding main roads, and trying to lose himself in the maze of London's underbelly. He couldn't trust anyone. Cross was a part of this, but who else? It was clear that someone with considerable influence was orchestrating this entire mess. Someone high up, someone who had been playing the long game. The faint glow of a street lamp caught his attention, and he turned into a narrow side street, pausing as his phone buzzed. A message. "Meet me at the safe house." Now, Hawke felt a flicker of hope. Evelyn. The one person who might still be on his side. He texted back quickly. "On my way." The safe house was located in a quiet residential area, just far enough off the grid to be off the radar of the intelligence community. The kind of place where people who didn't want to be found could vanish. It was run by people in the know, people who had learned how to stay out of the reach of anyone with a badge or a gun. He had no doubt that Evelyn was there, waiting for him. Please let this be real. Hawke's mind raced as he approached the old brownstone. The street was empty, silent. He scanned the area, instinctively checking for tails or surveillance, but it seemed clear. He moved quickly to the back entrance, using a spare key that Evelyn had given him months ago. The door creaked open, and the musty smell of aged wood and dust filled the air. He stepped inside, closing it behind him without a sound. The room was dimly lit, with the faint glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. There, sitting by the window, was Evelyn. Her posture was tense, her eyes sharp as they met his. "You're late," she said, though there was a trace of relief in her voice. "I had a few people I needed to lose along the way," Hawke replied, his voice low as he moved toward her. "What's the situation?" Evelyn stood and approached him, her expression unreadable. "I've been tracking the intel just like you asked, and I've found something disturbing." Hawke's heart skipped a beat. What? Whoever's behind this isn't just trying to take you out, Hawke. They're trying to take the entire agency down. Someone's been pulling strings from within. That much I know, he muttered, pacing. But we don't know who. Evelyn paused, her lips tightening. I think I have an idea. She handed him a file thick, marked with the unmistakable black and red stamp of classified material. Hawke took it without hesitation, flipping it open. Inside were more names, more faces, people from within the agency, and among them was one name that made his blood run cold. Viktor Mikhailov. The name hit like a punch to the gut. Mikhailov wasn't just a high-ranking official within MI6. He was the head of covert operations. The man who had mentored him, the one who had guided him through the darkest assignments of his career. And now his name was connected to a conspiracy that had already cost lives. This isn't possible, Hawke muttered, his pulse racing. Mikhailov's untouchable. He's been in the game longer than anyone. Evelyn's eyes were hard. That's exactly why you need to be careful. People like him don't make moves without a purpose. He's not acting alone. Hawke's fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the file. Then who else is involved? Evelyn moved to the desk, pulling up a set of encrypted files on the laptop. There's another layer to this operation. It's global. Mikhailov's influence reaches far beyond the UK. He's working with people who control entire intelligence networks, and they've been planting agents inside every major agency in Europe. They've been gathering intel, building alliances, and positioning themselves for something big. Hawke swallowed hard. What's the end game? Control, Evelyn said, her voice quiet but steady. Absolute power. This isn't just about taking down a few agents or stealing intel. It's about reshaping the entire intelligence community. If they pull this off, they'll have the power to dictate global politics, to make the world dance to their tune. Hawke clenched his jaw. And what does this have to do with me? They're using you as a scapegoat, Evelyn said, her eyes meeting his. They'll use your name to justify everything. If they can eliminate you, they can remove anyone who might stand in their way. Hawke's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of international intelligence and the people who would control it. We need to expose them, he said, his voice low with determination. But we need leverage. We need to find out what they're really planning, and fast. Evelyn nodded. There's one more thing. She clicked a few buttons on the laptop, bringing up a series of satellite images. These were taken from an intercept of one of Mikhailov's safe houses. They show a meeting taking place in Paris. Mikhailov's people are set to meet with someone in the next 48 hours. We need to get there before they do. Hawke studied the images, his mind calculating. You're sure this is real? I'm certain, Evelyn replied. This could be our chance to end it, to stop them before they can do any more damage. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind already formulating a plan. Paris. It had to be done quickly and without drawing attention. They were already a step behind, and that could cost them everything. We'll need a team, Hawke said, looking up, and we'll need to move fast. Evelyn gave him a slight smile. I'll make the arrangements. As she turned to make the call, Hawke moved to the window, looking out at the city below. The storm had only just begun, but this time he wouldn't be caught off guard. The final betrayal had already been set in motion, and there was no turning back now. Chapter 4. Shadows over Paris. Paris, 5:30 a.m. The city of lights had an entirely different feel at dawn. The early morning fog rolled in from the Seine, blanketing the cobblestone streets in a ghostly veil. Paris was still asleep, save for the occasional taxi that hummed its way through the sleepy avenues, heading toward unknown destinations. Hawke stepped off the plane, his eyes scanning the terminal. This wasn't a vacation, and it wasn't a mission he could afford to fail. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like a heavy cloak. He was still reeling from the discovery that Mikhailov, the man who had trained him, who had shaped his career, was involved in a conspiracy of this magnitude. It felt like an earthquake beneath his feet, but there was no time to linger on the shock. He had a job to do. And in Paris, everything would come to a head. Evelyn was already ahead of him. As always, she had moved swiftly to ensure they weren't caught in the open. Her network was vast, and her connections were untraceable. No one would know she was pulling the strings. That's why he trusted her. In a world where everything could be monitored, Evelyn had mastered the art of remaining unseen. He found her at a corner cafe near Montmartre, the one with the cracked porcelain cups and the smell of freshly brewed coffee clinging to the air. She looked out of place in the quiet morning, her gaze sharp, focused. No one would ever guess the gravity of the situation in the way she sat there, sipping her espresso with deliberate calmness. She nodded as he took a seat across from her, sliding a file across the table. "The meeting," she said, her voice low. "It's taking place here, in the Marais district. I've confirmed the location. It's a safe house, well guarded, but there's a blind spot." Hawke flipped through the file quickly, scanning the intel. A street-level apartment on Rue de Turin, guarded by two men who had been flagged as highly trained. Standard procedure, he thought. Still, it was no mistake that the location was tucked away in the heart of the city. The Marais was a labyrinth of old buildings, narrow alleys, and quiet courtyards. There was no room for error here. "You're sure?" Hawke asked, his fingers resting on the edge of the file. Evelyn met his eyes. "I'm sure. This is it. They'll be meeting with a high-ranking member of an international weapons syndicate. The kind of people who can make or break entire governments with a single transaction. If we can get in, we'll have them." Hawke's mind churned. The stakes had risen far beyond what they had initially planned. This wasn't just about stopping Mikhailov's betrayal anymore. This was about preventing a global catastrophe. The kind of event that could shift the balance of power in ways no one could predict. "We'll go in tonight," Hawke said, his voice steady. "Undercover. We'll take them down before they even know we're there." Evelyn looked at him, her expression unreadable. "We need to be careful. There are eyes everywhere. You've been compromised. We can't afford any mistakes." Hawke nodded. "I know." The sun had set by the time they arrived in the Marais. The streets were quieter now, the distant hum of the city blending into the shadows. Hawke moved with purpose, his coat buttoned tightly around him, concealing the weapons hidden beneath. Evelyn was close behind, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, every possible escape route. They reached the building, a nondescript, four-story structure with a faded wooden door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The windows above were dark, but Hawke knew better than to trust appearances. There were always layers. always more than met the eye. Evelyn gestured toward the back. "We'll take the alley," she whispered. "It's quieter." They moved quickly, slipping into the alley and rounding the corner to the service entrance. Evelyn pulled a set of lockpicks from her bag, working quickly to disengage the mechanism. Within seconds, the door clicked open. Inside, the hallway was dimly lit, the air musty and stale. Hawke's senses were on high alert as they moved toward the staircase, his every step deliberate and silent. He could hear the faint sounds of voices coming from above. The meeting was underway. They were running out of time. Hawke signaled to Evelyn to stay close, and they began their ascent, moving quietly from step to step, listening for any sounds that might betray their presence. At the third floor, they reached a small landing. There, they crouched, awaiting the next move. From their vantage point, they could hear snippets of conversation drifting through the thin walls. The words were inaudible, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, sharp, and filled with tension. Hawke's hand hovered over the hidden earpiece, ready to activate the comms. Now or never. Just as he was about to give the signal, Evelyn's voice cut through the silence. "There's a second team," she said, her voice tight with concern. "They're waiting at the back exit." Hawke's eyes narrowed. "We can't let them leave. We have to move fast." Evelyn nodded. "I'll cover the rear. You go in." With a quick glance, Hawke pushed forward, his body moving like a shadow. He was a ghost in the night, and he would remain that way until the moment came to strike at the door. Hawke paused, taking a deep breath. This was it. This was the confrontation that would either put an end to everything or make it all much worse. He kicked the door open. The room erupted in chaos. Chapter 5, The Long Game, Paris, 10:00 p.m. The door crashed open with a deafening bang, sending the men inside scrambling for cover. Hawke was already in motion, his body low and fast, eyes scanning the room for threats. The dim light from a single hanging bulb barely illuminated the faces of the men around the table, their eyes widening in shock as they reached for their weapons. The room, a makeshift office cluttered with maps, dossiers, and old coffee cups, erupted into a blur of movement. Evelyn, positioned at the back, immediately secured the rear exit, her silenced pistol in hand. Hawke's heart raced, but his training kept him calm. He'd been in situations far worse than this. Two of the men stood in an instant, their hands moving toward concealed weapons. But Hawke was faster. He dropped to one knee and fired 2 shots in rapid succession, both men crumpling to the floor in a quiet collapse. The third man, older, graying hair at his temples, froze in panic. His gun was halfway out of its holster when he saw the muzzle of Hawke's weapon trained directly on him. "Don't," Hawke said, his voice cold, every word measured. "Sit down." Slowly. The man hesitated for a heartbeat, then obeyed. Hawke's eyes never left him as he made his way toward the center of the room, stepping over the bodies of the fallen. Evelyn was already working her way around the perimeter, checking for any other threats. The sound of her footsteps against the floor was the only noise in the room, other than the ragged breathing of the remaining man. Hawke turned to him, his gun still raised. "Who are you working for?" The man's face was pale, sweat trickling down his brow. "I don't know what you mean." "Wrong answer," Hawke said. "Try again." The man visibly flinched. His hands trembled, but he knew better than to reach for his weapon again. I was just here to make sure the deal went smoothly. Who are you working for? Hawke repeated, his voice a sharp whisper of steel. The man swallowed hard. He was about to break. I told you, he said, his voice shaking. I don't know much, but the buyer, he's someone high up. Someone with connections. Powerful. Hawke leaned closer, his expression unwavering. Give me a name. The man's eyes darted nervously toward the door, but there was no way out. No one would be coming to help him. The air in the room felt thick with tension as the man gave in. Voss, he muttered, his words barely audible. Rainer Voss. At the mention of the name, a chill ran through Hawke's veins. Voss, the man he thought had died years ago. A legend in covert operations. A name that haunted the darkest corners of the intelligence world. A man who had the ability to shape the course of history from the shadows. Where is he? Hawke pressed, moving even closer now, his voice a dangerous whisper. The man shook his head desperately. I don't know, but there's a meeting, tomorrow, at a villa in the south of France. That's all I know. I swear. Hawke studied him for a moment, weighing his options. He could kill the man, end the information trail right here, but there was too much at stake. He needed to know more about the operation, about who was pulling the strings, and how deep this conspiracy really went. He glanced at Evelyn, who was now at the door, scanning the street for any signs of activity. No one had noticed the disruption yet. They still had time. Hawke looked back at the man. You're coming with us. The man opened his mouth to protest, but one look at the barrel of Hawke's gun was all it took to silence him. The next few minutes passed in tense silence as they carefully retraced their steps through the building. They moved quickly, using the shadows to their advantage, knowing that time was running out. The meeting was still happening. If they moved fast enough, they could catch whoever was responsible for orchestrating it. Outside, the streets of Paris were eerily quiet, the sound of distant traffic the only reminder that the city was still alive. They made their way to the car parked around the corner, its engine already running. Evelyn was behind the wheel, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds, always alert. South of France, she said, her tone calm but with an edge. We're going after Voss. Hawke nodded, sliding into the passenger seat. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing into a trap, but they had no other choice. They had to stop Voss before he could bring whatever plans he was concocting to fruition. And yet, as they drove through the empty streets of Paris, the feeling that they were being watched lingered in Hawke's mind, gnawing at him. The shadow of the conspiracy was growing, and it was following them every step of the way. Villa, south of France, 2:00 p.m. The villa was nestled in the hills outside Nice, a sprawling estate hidden behind high iron gates, the kind of place where the rich and powerful gathered to seal deals in secrecy, where the beautiful landscapes were mere window dressing for the dark dealings that took place within. Hawke and Evelyn arrived just as the sun reached its zenith, casting long shadows across the grounds. They parked a few hundred meters away from the gates and approached on foot, moving through the underbrush that lined the edge of the property. They knew they had to get inside without drawing attention. The last thing they needed was to trigger a security alarm or be caught by the guards. Evelyn checked her earpiece. The place is crawling with security. Cameras, guards, the works. Hawke nodded. We'll find a way in. They don't know we're coming. They skirted the perimeter of the villa, avoiding the well-lit paths and staying in the darkness. The villa was quiet, too quiet for their liking. But it didn't matter. This was where it would end. They reached the back of the villa, finding a maintenance door hidden in the shadows. Hawke quickly disabled the lock with ease, using the tools he had long since mastered. Once inside, they moved through the darkened halls, staying low and keeping silent. The echo of footsteps ahead sent a chill through Hawke. It was time. They were close, but as they rounded the corner, a voice broke through the tension. A voice that caused every muscle in Hawke's body to tense in recognition. "You shouldn't have come." It was Voss. And they were too late. Chapter 6. The trap is set. Villa, south of France, 2:15 p.m. The voice echoed through the dimly lit hallway, sending a ripple of tension through Hawke's spine. It was unmistakable Rainer Voss, the very man whose existence had been nothing more than a whispered legend, a ghost haunting the edges of the intelligence world. But here he was, standing before them in the flesh, as calm and poised as ever. Hawke's hand instinctively tightened around the grip of his gun, but he held his fire. His mind was racing, calculating the odds, assessing the situation. Voss wasn't just an adversary. He was a predator, one who never showed his hand too early, who knew how to manipulate every move on the board. Hawke wasn't about to walk into his trap without a plan. "Voss," Hawke said, his voice a razor-sharp whisper. He kept his tone steady, betraying nothing. "You're alive." Voss smiled, a cold, calculating expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Alive, yes, but I must admit, it's become increasingly difficult to stay in the shadows these days. Perhaps you can relate." He stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, his polished shoes making no sound against the marble floor. A slight gesture of his hand, and the door to the adjoining room clicked shut, sealing them in the narrow corridor. Hawke's eyes narrowed. Every instinct was screaming that this was a setup. There was no way Voss would be so careless as to let them close the distance. No, Voss wanted them to come. He wanted this confrontation. Evelyn's voice crackled through the earpiece, her words low and urgent. "Hawke, we've got company. A dozen or more coming in from the north side. We're surrounded." Hawke's jaw tightened, but he didn't break eye contact with Voss. The situation had escalated beyond anything they had anticipated. They had walked into a trap, and Voss knew it. "I must admit," Voss continued, his voice smooth, almost sympathetic, "I didn't think you'd get this far. But here we are. You should have stayed out of this, Hawke. This was never your fight." "Then why lead me here?" Hawke shot back. "Why now?" Voss's smile grew colder. "Because you're a problem. A loose end. And loose ends, well, they tend to unravel things, don't they?" The words were a threat wrapped in a smile, and Hawke could feel the weight of the danger pressing down on him. It was clear now. Voss had orchestrated everything. The documents, the betrayal. It had all been a game to him, one where Hawke had unwittingly played into his hand. That a muffled click came from behind them. Hawke turned instinctively, gun raised. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face obscured by a hood. "Don't move," the figure growled in a voice laced with authority. More figures emerged from the surrounding hallways, each one armed and moving with purpose. They were everywhere now. The villa had been a trap, designed to lure them in, to cut off their escape routes, to eliminate them. Hawke's eyes flicked to Evelyn, who was already moving, her body language calm but ready for action. She was a fighter, always ready for the worst. But they were outnumbered, 12 against 2. It wasn't a fair fight. Voss observed them, his cold gaze lingering on Evelyn for a moment before returning to Hawke. I had hoped for more cooperation from you, Hawke, but I understand. You've always been stubborn. It's part of your charm. Evelyn's voice came through the earpiece again, this time with an edge of panic. They're closing in faster. We don't have much time. Hawke's mind raced. They were cornered with no clear escape route. He had trained for moments like this, where the odds were against him, where every second counted. But Voss had anticipated his every move. The man was always one step ahead. You should have stayed out of this, Voss repeated, his voice almost a whisper now, as though relishing the moment. But it's too late for regrets. With a sudden motion, Voss nodded to his men. They moved in a synchronized motion, weapons raised, surrounding both Hawke and Evelyn. Hawke's grip on his gun tightened, but he didn't fire. Not yet. The clock was ticking. Get them, Voss commanded. In an instant, the room erupted into chaos. Villa, south of France, 2:20 p.m. The first man lunged at Hawke, but he was ready. With a fluid motion, Hawke sidestepped and slammed the butt of his gun into the attacker's jaw, sending him crashing to the floor. The second assailant was faster, lunging with a knife aimed directly for Hawke's throat. Hawke twisted, the blade missing by inches, and delivered a quick, brutal strike to the man's ribs, knocking him off balance. The knife clattered to the floor as the man staggered back, gasping for air behind him. He heard Evelyn engage her own attackers, her movements fast and precise. She was a blur of efficiency, a master of the fight. But even she couldn't take on so many alone. Hawke's eyes darted around the room, calculating. There was no escape, no window to jump out of, no ventilation shaft to crawl through. The walls seemed to close in as Voss's men encircled them. One of the attackers moved in from the left, but Hawke had already anticipated it. He brought his gun down in a sharp arc, striking the man's wrist with the butt of his weapon and sending his gun skittering across the floor. Before the man could react, Hawke delivered a blow to his stomach, sending him crashing into a nearby pillar. But the attackers just kept coming, wave after wave. The villa was now a battlefield, the air thick with the acrid smell of sweat and the sharp tang of fear. Every move felt like it could be his last. But Hawke wasn't one to fall easily. He was built for this. As another assailant closed in, Hawke ducked low, using the momentum to sweep the man's legs out from under him. The man hit the ground with a sickening thud, and Hawke moved in, his gun aimed at his head. But as he pressed the gun's barrel against the man's temple, his thoughts flashed back to Voss's words. Loose ends unravel things. This wasn't just a physical battle. It was a mind game, and Voss was playing it at a level Hawke had never imagined. Evelyn's voice broke through the chaos, sharp and commanding. Hawke, we need to move. Now. Hawke glanced toward her. She was holding her ground, but the odds were overwhelming. It was now or never. With a quick gesture, he motioned for her to move. Together, they charged through the fray, side by side, their movements synchronized. But just as they neared the exit, the door slammed shut with a deafening sound. Game's over. Hawke. Voss's voice came from behind them. This is where you die. The trap had been set, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. Chapter 7. Into the Abyss. Villa, south of France, 2:30 p.m. The door slammed shut behind them with an ominous finality, cutting off any hope of escape. Hawke and Evelyn were trapped, surrounded by Voss's men. Their backs pressed against the cold, unyielding stone of the villa's grand hallway. It was as if the entire world had narrowed to this single point in time, where every breath was heavier, every second stretched out like an eternity. The stakes had never been higher. Voss wasn't just playing for power, he was playing for everything. And the cold, calculated way he stared at them told Hawke everything he needed to know. There would be no mercy. Hawke's mind was already racing through options. His left hand clutched the handle of his gun, and his right was poised for anything. Another trap, a diversion, anything that could turn the tide. He had learned to think fast in situations like this. But this was different. The situation felt darker, more lethal. There was something about Voss's quiet confidence that sent a shiver down his spine. Evelyn was no less prepared. She stood beside him, weapon drawn, eyes scanning the room for threats, her body language tense but controlled. She was a fighter trained for moments like this. Still, even she knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. "Looks like we're going to have to earn our way out of this one," Evelyn said, her voice a low growl, her eyes never leaving the men surrounding them. Hawke didn't answer immediately. His mind was whirring with calculations. There were too many of them. Even if they managed to take down a few, they couldn't win this fight. Not here, not now. And then, like a predator savoring his catch, Voss stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. His smile was thin, almost mocking. "I have to admit, I underestimated you both. You've proven more resourceful than I expected. But this game is over." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "We both know you didn't bring us here for a chat," Hawke said, his voice sharp and steady. "So let's cut to the chase. What's your endgame, Voss? What's the real plan?" Voss's smile never wavered. He gestured toward the darkened corner of the hallway where a large wooden door stood, slightly ajar, as if beckoning them toward the unknown. "The endgame, Hawke, is simple. You've seen the documents. You know what's at stake. But you don't yet understand the full extent of the situation." He stepped closer, the echo of his footsteps loud in the tense silence. "You're not just a problem for me, you're a problem for the entire system, for everyone who's ever relied on secrecy. And as for the documents, well, let's just say they're a small part of a much larger puzzle. One that you've stumbled into." Hawke's mind raced. He had suspected as much. The mission had always been more than just retrieving a few files. It was about something far larger, something dangerous, and Voss was at the center of it all. "I don't need a lecture, Voss," Hawke said, his hand tightening around the gun. "You want to kill us, so just get it over with." Voss gave a soft chuckle. "Always straight to the point. I admire that, Hawke. But I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation. You won't die today. Not yet." Before Hawke could react, a sharp click sounded from behind him, followed by the cold barrel of a gun pressing against his neck. His pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. He had been in worse positions. He had made it through worse. "Turn around, Hawke." The voice behind him commanded. Hawke's instincts flared, but he moved with purpose, slowly turning to face the man who held the gun to his neck. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and his expression was one of cold indifference. He had the look of someone who had killed more times than he could count. "Who are you?" Hawke asked, his voice low. The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Does it matter? You won't be alive long enough to find out." As if on cue, the door behind them creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. The faint hum of machinery buzzed in the background. Voss's gaze flicked toward the door, then back at Hawke. "Welcome to the heart of the operation," Voss said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Where the real work happens." Hawke and Evelyn exchanged a brief, unreadable glance. They didn't have much of a choice. "Move," the man behind Hawke ordered, prodding him forward with the gun. Reluctantly, Hawke took a step toward the door, Evelyn close behind. The room beyond was a far cry from the rest of the villa's opulent decor. This was a place of purpose, a place for secrets. Hidden machines, filing cabinets, and monitors lined the walls. A single table sat at the center, covered with maps and files, each one marked with red ink and classified labels. Voss moved toward the table with deliberate steps. "Everything you've seen so far, every piece of the puzzle, it all leads here, to this moment." Hawke's eyes flicked to the array of screens on the far wall. They were all connected to something. He had seen the same technology used in high-stakes operations, surveillance networks, and covert military operations. "This isn't just about documents," Hawke said, his voice thick with realization. "It's about control, information. You've been pulling the strings, haven't you? For years." Voss paused, his fingers brushing against the files on the table. "I prefer to think of it as guiding the inevitable. You see, Hawke, chaos is inevitable, but order requires careful manipulation. That's what I've been doing, shaping the future." A cold, deadly silence filled the room as Hawke's words sank in. Voss wasn't just another operative in a covert war. He was a puppet master, and the world had been his stage. "You've set up a chain of events that could bring nations to their knees," Evelyn said, her voice tight with anger. Voss turned to her, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "That's one way of putting it. Another is that I've set the world on the path to salvation. Your perspective is limited, Evelyn." Hawke's mind worked quickly. He knew they had to act now. They couldn't let Voss put his plan into motion. But the odds were against them. The walls were closing in, and time was running out. "What happens now?" Hawke asked, his voice colder than ever. Voss's smile widened, a glimmer of victory in his eyes. "Now we finish this." In a flash, the room erupted into chaos. The sound of heavy footsteps filled the air as men surged forward, guns raised. But Hawke wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. He was a ghost in this world, a shadow always one step ahead. And in that moment, he would remind them all just how dangerous he could be. Chapter 8. The Final Hour. An abandoned dockyard. 9:45 p.m. The cold sea breeze cut through Hawke's jacket, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were razor-sharp, each one slicing through the tension like a blade. The dockyard ahead was dark, bathed in the muted glow of scattered street lamps. their light flickering like dying stars. The air tasted of salt and decay, the scent of rusted metal and wet concrete. It was the perfect place for a deal of this magnitude. Isolated, hidden from prying eyes, that he glanced over at Evelyn, who stood beside him, her expression unreadable. The escape from Voss's villa had been barely orchestrated, a dangerous, near impossible maneuver that had left them with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear: this was the moment. The one that could either seal their fate or give them a chance to unravel the conspiracy before it was too late. The phone in Hawke's pocket vibrated, the ringtone a low, insistent buzz. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from his old contact, Morgan. "It's happening. Tonight. You need to be there." He shoved the phone back into his pocket. Morgan's words were direct, urgent. The clock was ticking. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "What's happening, Hawke? Who's this contact?" "A trusted ally," Hawke said, his voice tight with anticipation. "He's been tracking Voss's movements. Tonight's the night we either expose everything or lose it all." They both knew what was at stake. The documents they had retrieved from the villa, encrypted, highly classified intelligence, had proven Voss's operation was far beyond a rogue faction within the government. It was global, a carefully crafted plan to bring entire nations to the brink of collapse. Economic warfare, covert sabotage, destabilization, all aimed at achieving a singular goal: power. Absolute power. "Let's just hope Morgan's intel is as good as he says," Evelyn muttered, her fingers tightening around the grip of her handgun. "Otherwise, we're walking right into Voss's trap." Hawke nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. Voss had already proven himself a master manipulator, always one step ahead. This confrontation at the dockyard was a risk, but they had no other choice. If they couldn't stop the transfer of the files, if they couldn't sever the connection between Voss and his backers, the consequences would be catastrophic. They moved with calculated precision, shadows blending with the darkness as they approached the loading bay at the far end of the yard. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Suddenly, a vehicle pulled into view, a black SUV, the headlights slicing through the night like a knife. It stopped just beyond the entrance to the warehouse, and two figures stepped out, their faces hidden beneath hoods. "That's them?" Evelyn whispered, her eyes scanning the area. "Voss's men." Hawke's grip tightened on the rifle slung over his shoulder. It was time. He nodded to Evelyn, signaling for her to take the high ground. He would deal with the ground level. The plan was simple: separate the men, create chaos, and get to the truth. As Evelyn slipped into position, Hawke moved quickly, silently, his boots barely making a sound on the wet concrete. His heartbeat was steady, his mind calm despite the urgency of the situation. Every muscle was coiled, ready to spring. The two figures by the SUV were talking in low voices, too far for Hawke to hear clearly. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Focused, he was about to cross a line, one that would either save countless lives or doom them all. But there was no turning back now. He took a step forward, his footfall muffled against the ground, and in a flash he was behind them, a shadow in the night. With a swift movement, Hawke reached out, grabbing one of the men by the throat and slamming him against the side of the SUV. The man let out a muffled yelp, and Hawke's knee pressed into his chest, keeping him pinned. The second man spun around, reaching for his gun, but Evelyn was already there. A single shot rang out from above, and the man crumpled to the ground without a sound. Hawke turned back to the first man, his grip tightening as he lifted him off the ground. "Where is Voss?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The man's eyes widened, fear seeping through the facade of toughness. "He's inside. He's waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" Hawke's voice was cold as ice. "Why?" The man stammered, his breath coming in short gasps. "You don't know, do you? It's too late. Everything's already set in motion. Voss. He's the one who's been pulling your strings all along. You've been nothing but a pawn in his game." Hawke's grip tightened, but before he could respond, there was a sound, a distant noise, followed by the unmistakable growl of an engine starting. Hawke's eyes flicked toward the noise, his instincts kicking in. "They're leaving," he muttered. Evelyn was already moving, sliding down from her perch with practiced grace. She fired a warning shot into the air, a signal for the others to make their move. They needed to get inside, now. The moment stretched out, each second more precious than the last. Hawke released the man, letting him collapse to the ground, but there was no time to interrogate him further. The game had changed. If Voss was making his move now, it was time to stop him once and for all. They sprinted toward the entrance, weapons raised. The door to the warehouse was slightly ajar, the dim light from inside casting long shadows across the floor. Inside, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed, and the flicker of shadows against the walls signaled that they weren't alone. As they entered the warehouse, a familiar voice, one that made Hawke's blood run cold, rang out from the darkness. "Welcome, Hawke." Voss stepped into view, flanked by several armed men. His expression was calm, almost serene, as if he had expected this moment all along. "You should have stayed out of this," Voss continued, his voice smooth as silk. "But I suppose you couldn't resist. Always the hero, aren't you?" Hawke's hand flexed around his weapon, but he didn't raise it yet. Not yet. There was something wrong here, something about the way Voss spoke, the way he moved. Hawke had known it all along. Voss had been 2 steps ahead. But this was something else entirely. "What's the play, Voss?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any sign of a trap. Voss chuckled, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling amusement. "The play, my dear, is survival. A new world is coming. The old systems, governments, alliances, treaties, they're all crumbling. What you have in your hands is just a small piece of the puzzle. A puzzle that I've spent years putting together." The pieces were falling into place. Voss wasn't just after power, he was after control. He was preparing to destabilize the entire world, and Hawke and Evelyn had been the final variables in his carefully planned equation. And now, there was nothing left to do but stop him or die trying. "You're too late," Voss said with a smirk. "The countdown has already begun." Hawke's mind raced as he locked eyes with Evelyn. They had one shot at this. One shot to stop the collapse of everything they knew. "Not today," Hawke said, his voice as cold as steel. That it was time to finish this. Chapter 9. A Game of Shadows. The Warehouse. 10:15 p.m. The moment stretched out like a taut wire, vibrating with tension. Hawke's breath was steady, but his mind raced through 100 possibilities. Voss's men were scattered throughout the dark warehouse, weapons raised, but the air seemed thick with something more than just the threat of violence. It was the heavy feeling of inevitability, like the universe had been steering them all toward this single moment. "You're wasting your time, Hawke," Voss said with a cold smile, his hands clasped behind his back. "This game is already over." The words hit like a slap, and for a second, Hawke's mind flashed back to the first time he'd crossed paths with Voss, a man who had always been a step ahead, pulling strings in the shadows. But this time, things were different. This time, Hawke had the upper hand, or so he hoped. His eyes flicked to Evelyn. She was positioned to the side, her back against the wall, scanning the room with lethal precision. Her gun was raised, her body poised like a predator waiting to strike. But there was something in her expression, a flicker of doubt, perhaps. Hawke couldn't afford to be distracted by it. Not now. "Enough talk," Hawke said, his voice low, almost a growl. "If you think you've won, you're even more delusional than I thought." Voss chuckled, stepping closer, his boots making soft echoes in the silence. "I've always admired your persistence, Hawke, but you're just a small cog in a much larger machine. You don't see the full picture, do you?" "I see enough to know you're going down," Hawke replied, his eyes narrowing as he slowly reached for his rifle. The weapon felt like a part of him, cold, deadly, and efficient. Just like the man holding it. Voss's smile faded, his face turning sharp with malice. "You really don't get it, do you? The documents you've been carrying." He paused for a moment, his eyes glinting with amusement. "They're nothing, just a distraction, a means to an end." Hawke's mind snapped into focus. The documents, everything they had fought for, the countless hours, the bloodshed, had been for something insignificant. Then what was the point, Voss? Hawke's voice was quiet, but his eyes burned with suspicion. "Why all this trouble? Why try to kill me? Why bring me into your web?" Voss smirked again, and Hawke's pulse quickened. He had seen that look before, the same calculating coldness that preceded a devastating move. "Because, my dear Hawke," Voss said, his voice silky smooth, "you're the final piece of the puzzle." The statement hit Hawke like a punch to the gut. But before he could react, Voss motioned with a subtle flick of his hand. The air seemed to crackle with energy as several of Voss's men shifted, moving into positions that trapped them all in a deadly triangle. Hawke cursed under his breath. The room, once their battleground, had now become a death trap. "Evelyn, get to cover," Hawke barked, but before she could move, the sound of gunfire rang out. The first shot came from the shadows, a crack that shattered the stillness, followed by a burst of fire from another direction. Evelyn ducked instinctively, rolling to the side as bullets tore through the air, ricocheting off the metal beams and concrete walls. The flash of muzzle fire illuminated the room in harsh strobe-like bursts, casting grotesque shadows over the scene. Hawke dropped to the ground, his body reacting without thinking, and returned fire with precision. The men surrounding him ducked, seeking cover behind large crates and metal pillars. "Move!" he shouted to Evelyn, his voice sharp. She darted across the room, her movements calculated, fluid. She wasn't just a partner in this mission. She was his equal. But even the best couldn't always outmaneuver an ambush. Hawke's eyes flicked toward Voss, who had disappeared into the shadows. The man was playing his cards carefully, retreating, letting his men take the brunt of the fight. Hawke could almost see the smirk on his face as he observed the chaos he'd orchestrated. But Hawke wasn't fooled. Voss thought he was in control, but Hawke knew something the man didn't. The documents, they were more than just a distraction. They were the key to everything. With a swift motion, Hawke ejected the magazine from his rifle and swapped it for a fresh one. He wasn't going to let Voss escape this time. Not again. "Where are you, Voss?" Hawke muttered under his breath as he advanced, staying low to the ground, using the shadows to mask his movements. The gunfire was deafening now, echoing off the steel walls and ringing in his ears, but he kept his focus sharp as he neared the back of the warehouse. A door swung open, and Voss stepped into view, his arms raised in mock surrender. His face was still that same calculating mask, but now there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of desperation. "You can't stop this, Hawke," Voss said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The pieces are already in motion. You're just too blind to see it." Hawke's grip tightened on his weapon. He wasn't going to let Voss manipulate him any longer. "You've already lost," Voss continued, his voice softer now, as though trying to persuade Hawke to give up, to accept the inevitable. "The countdown has begun. There's no stopping it now. Then let's see if I can't prove you wrong," Hawke said, his eyes narrowing with deadly intent. Voss's gaze flickered briefly toward a control panel on the far side of the room, and it was then that Hawke realized what was happening. The real game wasn't the fight in the warehouse, it was the countdown Voss had mentioned. A catastrophic event, one that could change everything. As the realization hit, Hawke's heart skipped a beat. He had to stop whatever Voss was about to unleash. Time was running out. The seconds ticked by in a blur, and suddenly the lights went out. The entire warehouse was plunged into darkness. The only sounds now the echoing thrum of Hawke's heartbeat and the rapid footsteps of men moving in the shadows. "Evelyn!" Hawke shouted, reaching out blindly. But the darkness only deepened, and in that moment, all he could hear was the faintest hum, low, ominous. Something was happening. Something terrible. He wasn't sure how much time they had left, but it was clear. The final betrayal had been set in motion, and unless he stopped it now, everything would fall apart. It's time to end this. With that thought, Hawke moved forward, stepping into the unknown, his heart set on one goal: preventing the world from unraveling. But as the doors to the control room slid open, he knew there was one final confrontation waiting for him. And this time, there would be no escape. Chapter 10. The final move. The hum in the air grew louder as Hawke stepped into the control room, his boots hitting the cold concrete floor with a thud. The flickering emergency lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, but it was the faint blue glow from the control panels that caught his attention. A series of switches and levers stood before him, their purpose cryptic but unmistakable. Something catastrophic was about to unfold if he didn't act fast. Behind him, the faint echo of footsteps reminded him that Voss wasn't far behind. The man was always there, lurking in the shadows, pulling the strings, but Hawke wasn't about to let him get the upper hand again. Hawke's eyes scanned the room in a split second, taking in the layout, the equipment, the tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. Every instinct screamed at him to be careful, to trust nothing. But he had to act. Time was running out. The countdown. The unmistakable display on the far wall blinked in neon red, showing a sequence of numbers ticking down at a relentless pace. 30 seconds. He had 30 seconds to stop whatever nightmare Voss had unleashed. Not so fast, Hawke. Voss's voice broke through the silence, cutting through the weight of the moment like a knife. His footsteps echoed as he stepped into the room, flanked by his men. There was no escape this time. Hawke's hand instinctively reached for the gun at his side, but he didn't draw it. He needed answers. What is this, Voss? What are you trying to do? Voss stood tall, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. You're not going to stop it, Hawke. You never could. He took a step closer, the shadow of authority hanging over him like a specter. This isn't just about the documents anymore. This is about control. You were never supposed to make it this far. The events of the last few days? All planned. Every move you made, every person you met. It's been a game. A game. The words echoed in Hawke's mind as the pieces finally clicked together. The betrayal, the mission, the ambush. It had all been orchestrated from the start. Voss had manipulated him from the beginning, leading him down a path to ensure he was too distracted to see the truth. The documents, the fight, even the mysterious figures that had crossed his path. It had all been part of a larger plan. You think I don't know that? Hawke snapped, his voice colder than ice. You think I don't know who you really are, Voss? This isn't just about control. This is about power. The smirk on Voss's face deepened. Yes, but you've already lost, Hawke. The machine is in motion, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Your role in this is finished. Hawke's eyes narrowed, but his pulse remained steady. He couldn't let Voss get to him. Then you're more delusional than I thought. The countdown continued. 20 seconds. Voss stepped forward, his confidence unwavering. But there was a flicker of unease in his eyes now. He'd expected Hawke to falter, to panic. But Hawke wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Tell me, Voss, Hawke said, voice calm despite the chaos around them. Do you really think you can control everything? Do you think you can break me like you did all those others? Voss didn't answer. Instead, his hand hovered over a red button on the control panel. A button that, if pressed, would set off whatever catastrophe he had planned. The clock was ticking, the seconds slipping away faster than Hawke's thoughts could keep up. But Hawke was prepared. His body moved with a speed honed by years of training, his instincts guiding him as he lunged forward, grabbing Voss's wrist and twisting it violently. The button was just within reach, but Voss fought back with all his strength, his other hand reaching for the weapon at his side. The two men grappled, the sound of their struggle drowned out by the whir of the countdown clock. But it was clear that Hawke's focus was singular. He couldn't let Voss activate whatever weapon or system he had in mind. Not now. Not when everything depended on this moment. With a final twist of his arm, Hawke disarmed Voss, knocking him to the ground with a solid thud. The man grunted, his body recoiling from the impact. But there was no time to relish the victory. Hawke's hand flew to the control panel, desperately searching for the override switch, the way to stop the countdown. Not this time, Hawke, Voss spat, struggling to his feet. You don't understand the scope of what you're up against. Hawke ignored him. His eyes locked on the blinking countdown as his fingers danced across the keys. Each press was calculated, precise, his mind racing with each second lost. 10 seconds. It wasn't enough time. It wasn't going to be enough. Hawke's heart pounded in his chest. But his mind remained calm. This was it. If he couldn't stop it now, everything he had done would be for nothing. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, but he couldn't afford to falter. And then, with a final press of a button, the countdown stopped. The room was eerily silent as the numbers froze. 0. The threat was gone. Hawke exhaled sharply, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The relief was brief, like the calm after a storm, but it was enough. The danger had been averted. But there was no victory dance, no celebration. Voss stared at him, disbelief in his eyes. How? Hawke turned away from the control panel, his eyes locked onto Voss. Because I'm one step ahead of you, Voss. Always have been. As he walked past the defeated man, Hawke pulled his earpiece free and contacted Evelyn. It's done. Get to the extraction point. The warehouse doors behind him creaked open, and Hawke stepped into the cool night air, the weight of the past few days lifting slightly from his shoulders. It wasn't over, not yet. There would be more battles to fight, more enemies to face. But for now, he had won. And that was enough. He glanced back one last time at the man who had orchestrated the chaos, the man who had almost destroyed everything. But in the end, Voss had been nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game. The war wasn't over. It never would be. But for now, Hawke had the last word. And that was the final betrayal.